I don't know about you all, but I'm a light sleeper. All it takes for me to be woken up is my wife turning over, one of the dogs deciding to find a new spot on the bed, or even the lightest of knocks from one of my kids to tell me that they need water or that they've just had a nightmare. Certain things, though, such as the constant humming of a fan, definitely do help to keep me asleep. One such thing that puts me to sleep like a charm is the sound of rain falling on the roof and windows. However, when it goes from a nice steady rain to a torrential downpour that is accompanied with booming thunder and winds that make you think that the windows are going to burst and the roof is going to tear off your house, then sleep becomes almost an impossibility. Yet, for Jesus, this wasn't the case. Instead, while out on a rickety boat on sea and in a storm that caused his disciples to think that they were literally going to die, and just to be clear, a third of which were none other than fishermen who spent the vast majority of their life at sea and had no doubt encountered more storms than they could count, through all that, Jesus was sound asleep. So these fearful and panicking disciples did the only thing that they could think of, which was to wake Jesus up from his nap and to ask for him to save them. And how he went about doing that was something that amazed them all. This is the passage that we come to today in our verse by verse study through the book of Matthew, and we've got a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. All right, now before we do get started, as always, if you do happen to be new here, I am James West, and this channel is the Lion's Den Academy, which is all about bringing you closer to God through an in-depth study of His Word. As I mentioned, this is a part of the verse-by-verse study that we are currently doing through the book of Matthew, and this video is part 39 of that series. And if in-depth, engaging, and hopefully entertaining Bible study is something that you enjoy, then I would love for you to join the Academy here and click the subscribe and notification bell as well. All of that said, let's now start by reading today's passage in full, which is found in Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. And it reads, "And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, 'Save us, Lord, we are perishing.' And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?' Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, 'What sort of man is this, that even the winds and sea obey him?'" The passage starts by saying, "And when he got in the boat, his disciples followed him." So let's back up for a moment here and go back to the verse in the last passage that we studied about the cost of following Jesus. Verse 18 of that passage reads, "Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side." So this was right before they got into the boat to cross the Sea of Galilee. And after he gave those orders, that is when the scribe who hadn't counted the cost of following Jesus was all too quick to say that he'd follow him, whereas the disciple who was all too slow to place following Jesus at the top of his priority list came up with excuses to sit on the sidelines. And if you haven't checked out that video, then I would definitely encourage you to do so either before continuing with this study or checking it out after completing this one. And I will link that down in the description below for you. But that said, what does this show us? Well, let's examine first who is actually in the boat. In verse 23, it makes it very clear that that it is Jesus and his disciples. So Jesus led by getting into the boat, and his disciples followed him, leaving the crowd that had been pressing around him on the shore. This also means that once the storm came, that those that stayed behind were quite likely already in shelter or able to get to shelter fairly quickly. And even if they weren't able to, at worst, they simply got wet and had no real chance of dying other than the extremely minute chance that they were struck by lightning. Whereas it was Jesus' disciples that were the ones that were placed in the precarious situation of being out at sea during a violent storm. However, this also means that those that stayed behind didn't get to spend more time with Jesus, and it also means that they didn't get to witness God in the flesh calming a storm with but a word. Now, there are two sister or parallel passages to this that we find in Mark 4, 35 through 41 and Luke 8, 22 through 25, which can provide us with some additional information and context. For example, in Mark, we read that Jesus and these men set off on their boats in the evening and that there were other boats that were there with them. Who were in these boats, we don't really know. And if they were Jesus' disciples, then I think based on the context of the entire passage, I think it's safe to say that they all made it to the other side safe and sound as well. That said, though, one of the things I try to do on this channel for you all is to really bring these verses alive and make them more immersive for you. So let's take a moment here to talk about this boat in general. After all, weathering a storm on a sea in a modern day yacht is one thing, but doing so in a handmade wooden boat that never had to pass any sort of inspection is another thing entirely. It's kind of like the difference in how safe you feel on different kinds of roller coasters. The modern ones that are all metal with all the latest sensors and hydraulic brakes make you feel completely safe even when you are doing loops at speeds over 100 miles an hour. Well, okay, I'll be fair. It makes most people feel safe. Well, some of you, like my wife, are like, I ain't going to tempt the Lord and put myself on that contraption. However, when we get on roller coasters that are made completely out of wood, even though we still ride them, we can't help but think, man, all it's going to take is one bad board and this whole thing is going to come crashing down like a house of cards. So, taking that logic to boats, I can only imagine how terrifying any sort of storm would be in a boat back in those days. Archaeological evidence shows us that these boats would likely hold about 15 men, while they most likely had different variations in sizes, just like the boats and vehicles that we have today that are built by different people. They were most likely around 27 feet long, 7 to 8 feet wide, and around 4 to 5 foot tall. So, all that said, it's a pretty tiny ship to be in when being out at sea during a violent storm, especially in a situation where, as verse 24 tells us, the boat was being swamped by the waves. I would imagine that most of you are fortunate enough, like me, to have never experienced being on the ocean in any kind of boat in these kind of conditions. At the same time, though, I think that most of us would agree that if we had to choose what type of boat that we're going to take 25-foot waves head on with, I think that we would all pick the biggest, most modern-day fiberglass boat that ever existed over a small, rickety wooden boat that good old cousin Shmuel built. Even then, though, some storms and waves will topple and crush any boat, no matter its size or expert construction. There have been some great movies that depict this, such as like The Perfect Storm, and it reminds us of just how small and powerless we are against the forces of nature. And the reality of the ship being tipped over or capsized is a very real possibility, and surviving a situation where that happens would have been fairly impossible back in those days, and even today it's next to impossible unless the Coast Guard is already aware of the situation and has rescue swimmers headed to you before the ship goes down. Now, the body of water that they were crossing is known as the Sea of Galilee. And as you can see, it's what I think most of us, just from looking at a map, would more so classify as a large lake than a sea. But nonetheless, that's what they called it. Size-wise, it's about 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. And I know that doesn't sound super large, but just to be clear, on water, on a perfectly clear day, at about 3 miles, you no longer have sight of land. And as we can see from the map, this is located in the north part of Israel, and with it being the only freshwater lake the country possessed, it was a rather central hub for fishing. And we read about several fishing towns surrounding the lake in the Gospels, such as Capernaum and Bethsaida. Now, while the lakes aren't typically where we think of encountering waves, during violent storms, they do nonetheless occur. And just to give you a picture of how high those waves could be, on October 25th, 2017, a wave as high as 29 feet tall was recorded on Lake Superior right here in the United States. Now, we also do need to keep in mind that boats in those days had two ways of moving on the water: by sail or by rowing. And violent winds could easily tear apart your sail or break your mast, leaving you miles out at sea with nothing but rows to bring you to your destination. So, with the stage set, let's now turn our attention towards the emotions and actions of the disciples, which we can read in verse 25 through 26, which says, "And they went and woke him, saying, 'Save us, Lord, we are perishing.' And he said to them, 'Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?'" So, the emotion that had gripped the disciples was fear, which is really an acronym for false evidence appearing real. You see, certain situations seem terrifying in the moment, but if we are able to take ourselves out of the situation and look at it from a holistic perspective, then we realize that we were worried about nothing. For these disciples, the roaring wind and raging seas no doubt pulled their minds focused to where all they could picture was drowning. However, if they had been focusing on Jesus instead, they would have realized that they have nothing to fear. After all, he is not only fully God, but he was there to fulfill the most important work that God had in store for the world. And once you realize that nothing could ever, can ever, or will ever interfere with God's plan, then for these disciples, they should have realized that they were on a boat with the main character of the show. What I mean by that is, you know how when you watch a show and the show fully revolves around a main character, and if that show isn't super boring but actually has action, suspense, and drama to it, then they will usually place the main character in very precarious situations where it at least makes it seem like they might very well die. But since the show is and it revolves around them, you kind of know deep down, that they're always going to find a way to make it out on top. Even if it's one of those scenes where it looks like they just got blown up in an explosion or fell off a huge cliff and their friend or sidekick is looking all sad and depressed, and then the main character just comes up walking behind them without a scratch on them. For example, and I'm showing my age a bit on this one, but take the classic show MacGyver. And if you kids don't know what I'm talking about, it's a show about a guy named MacGyver, of course, who not only had a mullet that all the guys back then wanted, but he also had a degree in chemistry and physics and was a bomb diffuser in Vietnam. And in every episode, he would be put into a situation where any of us would certainly die in. Yet he would finesse his way out of it with a hairpin, 2 matches, and some nail polish remover. So after a few episodes of being conditioned to this, you knew that pretty much no matter how bad it looked, nothing was going to happen to him, and he would always find a way out. Although the manner in which he was able to do so is what kept the show on the air for as long as it was. I say all that to say that the same viewpoint should have been held by the apostles here. While they, of course, aren't in a scripted TV show, they were nonetheless a part of the most important story of all time. And they should have had complete confidence that there was no way that God would have let anything happen, not only to Jesus before he fulfilled his work, but also to them before they completed their work. However, fear is something that naturally does want to arise within us, and there is certainly healthy fear, which I will address here in a second. However, once we recognize the fear within us as something that isn't keeping us safe and healthy, but is instead holding us back from pursuing what God has for us, or is causing us to diminish the trust that we have in God, then there are 2 verses that come to mind that we should hold on to. The first is found in Romans 8:31, which says, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" The second is from verse 4 of what is probably the most well-known psalm that there is, Psalm 23, which says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." As I mentioned, there is absolutely a healthy kind of fear, though. The kind that, like a spidey sense, keeps us safe from engaging in activities and situations, or even walking down a sketchy dark alley where it might likely come into harm or face death even. Although there are certainly people in this world that, in a very unhealthy manner, silence this healthy fear that they have within them. For instance, have you seen these daredevils? They mainly seem to be from Russia, from what I can tell, but they go up onto like these building scaffoldings, roofs, ledges, and cranes, and of these skyscrapers and stuff, and will do things that literally make my stomach hurt just from watching it, like hoverboarding right on the edge of a roof, to not just hanging off the edge, but intentionally going one-handed and doing clapping pull-ups. And all it takes is one misgrip, and these people are just done for. Fortunately, most of us, though, we do pay heed to the healthy fear that arises when we're in high places and things like that. However, there is also unhealthy fear as well. And unfortunately, far too many of us are gripped by this, and it not only shows a lack of trust in God, but it also holds us back from boldly doing God's work, and it acts like chains, keeping us anchored and unable to grow. For some of you, that might be silencing the fear and trusting in God to completely change career fields and find a job that actually uses the spiritual gifts that God has given you to shape and impact the world around you. For some of you, this might mean being bold and courageous enough to ask out that girl or guy on a date. Perhaps some of you are already dating and you simply need to step out in faith and ask this person to marry you, but fear is holding you back, even though God has put it on your heart that this is someone that you should marry. Perhaps, though, for some of you, this is simply battling your fear about what others will think of you and being rejected, and to step out in faith and to spread the gospel to those that God has placed in your life. Now, other than these examples of how fear can hold you back, fear does have other effects on us as well. As Yoda would say,
"Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering."
Now, while Yoda is, of course, a fictitious character, he certainly is preaching the truth here, since fear absolutely leads us down a dark path. Just to show you what I mean, let's take a quick look at Galatians 5:22 through 23, which defines the fruits of the Spirit, which, just to be clear, is talking about the emotions and characteristics that naturally flow out of us when we are walking a godly path, and as such, we are filled with the Holy Spirit. The passage reads, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control." That said, let's take a quick assessment. How many of you all are able to be super loving when you are afraid? Like love just comes pouring out of you when you're fearful about the economy, inflation, or when you're wondering how much the latest trip to the gas station is going to cost not only your kids' college fund, but also your retirement. How many of you felt what you could only describe as pure joy the last time you were afraid? How many of you felt at peace? How about patience? Do any of you guys get super testy and on edge, ready to snap at anything while your fear is at its peak? I could go, through the entire rest of this list, but for time's sake, I'm going to leave that up to you. Feel free to go ahead and pause this video and do a deep assessment with how fear holds you back from fully experiencing each fruit of the Spirit. You see, fear never attacks us alone, though. It always likes to bring its friend, anxiety. And anxiety is something that is absolutely contagious. And you can see that in real life settings where people become more and more animated and raise their voices to the point of screaming, sometimes causing people to escalate to the point of even creating or participating in a violent riot, which would be something that they would never imagine doing or being capable of doing in any other situation. And we can also even see this play out in other ways, such as the stock market tanking based on people's extreme fear and anxiety that is created when they see nothing but red when they look at their stock portfolio. After all, we do have a whole index, the VIX, that is known as the fear index that essentially tracks this very phenomenon. Now, while anxiety is contagious, so too is peace and calmness. If someone is able to stop the cycle and lower their voice and act in a calm and peaceful way, it radically shifts the entire atmosphere and their calmness spreads to others. And having the calmness that comes from being anchored to Christ and fully trusting in Him to provide, protect, and lead you in every situation gives you a peace that transcends most people's comprehension. By having Jesus as your rock, you then also become a rock for others around you when things go wrong. And we can all be assured that things will at some point go wrong. There's also a really fun side effect of this too, especially when you feel fairly certain that what is happening to you or around you is a spiritual attack. That side effect is that you get to smile and laugh at the fact that Satan isn't getting to you. You know how mainly when we were kids, there would be other kids that would love to tease you, whether it was, copying you or doing that thing where, they don't actually touch you, but they get really close to touching you just to the point where they annoy you and drive you crazy.
Touching me. She's touching me.
I'm not touching you.
You're touching me.
Not touching.
Touching me.
Whatever they might try to do to get under your skin, what's the one thing that parents would always say that would be true? Ignore it and act like it doesn't bother you, since they are just looking to get a reaction out of you. And if you don't give them a reaction, they will stop and move on and find someone else to bother that will give them the reaction that they're looking for. Well, the same thing is true when the enemy attacks us. He wants a reaction, and his ultimate goal is to get you fearful, so upset, so hurt, and so angry that you take your focus off of God and begin to create a barrier between God and you. So, it always makes me smile a bit when I can recognize what is happening to me is a spiritual attack, and I know that by me not responding to it in the way that the enemy wants me to, totally messes up his agenda. What's even better, though, is when you praise and worship God even in those situations. Oh man, Satan, he just doesn't know what to do with himself. We see this firsthand in the book of Job, and when Satan tries to get him to curse God by killing not only all of his livestock, aka taking away all of his wealth, but also kills all of his kids, Job responds with, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the Lord." Which prompts Satan to go into a hissy fit and up the ante by making Job covered with sores all over. Yet Job remained faithful, and in turn, God gave him back twice as much as the enemy took from him. Responding this way reminds me of the classic Christmas movie, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. If you've seen it, I'm sure you remember that classic scene where the Grinch steals everything from the entire town, even the tiniest crumb for a mouse, And he, of course, expects them to wail and cry over their loss, but instead, he is completely dumbfounded when he sees them all gathered together, holding hands and singing the exact same way that when we worship God, even when Satan takes everything physical from us, to include our property, possessions, wealth, and even our health, it causes Satan to literally lose his mind. And there's something that is inherently satisfying about knowing that. All right, so all that said, let's move back to today's passage and take a moment to focus on the part in verse 25 that says, "And they went and woke him." Now, the first thing that I want to point out is the additional details that Mark gives us in chapter 4, verse 38 of his gospel, which tells us that Jesus was in the stern of the boat and sleeping on a cushion, which for you non-naval folks, that means that Jesus was asleep in the rear of the ship that almost assuredly had a roof over it, although it would have been a space he would have had to likely crawl into. And since he was on a cushion, that meant that he was also elevated off the ground, which does make a bit more understanding as to how Jesus was able to sleep during such a storm, since he would have been not only dry, but tucked away from the wind, and the cushion was also likely more comfortable than some of the sleeping conditions that he had warned the scribe about from the last passage that we studied. What's interesting to note, though, is that we never hear about Jesus sleeping in any other passage, although this certainly wasn't the only time that he did. It's just that unless a person sleeping is relevant to any narrative that someone is telling, it's usually something that's not mentioned, since it's something that's implied and it doesn't really make for gripping storytelling to bring it up every time it happens. However, this act does show a very real human side to Jesus. Similarly to what we see in other passages, such as where Jesus was weary, so he sat down to rest at the well in Samaria, where Jesus wept over Lazarus' dead body before raising him back to life, and where Jesus was filled with trepidation over the suffering he was about to bear on the cross, to the point that he was sweating blood. Now, when they woke him up, in Matthew we read that they said to him, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." Although in Mark we are told that the disciples said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" While in Luke, it says that they said, "Master, Master, we are going to drown." While some might view this as the synoptic gospels not being harmonized here, in reality, though, there were several panicked disciples on that boat, and each of these statements were likely said by a different disciple, almost assuredly along with several other statements that weren't even recorded. This is similar to how the testimonies of different eyewitnesses of the same event will describe what they saw based on the different things and people that they were focused on or able to see and hear from their location. And in regards to these disciples, they were all in different locations on that boat, and in a raging storm that likely meant that they were only able to really make out what the people closest to them were saying, even on a ship of that small of a size. Even Jesus' response to them, though, is recorded slightly different in the other Gospels as well. But that shouldn't surprise us either, since even in a calm and non-panicked environment, if I or anyone else said a sentence to 10 different people without them having the ability to video or audio record it, and instead they had to wait at the very least a day before they could even write it down, do you think that everyone would be able to write that down, that exact sentence, word for word, and that each person's recording would be the exact same? Granted, some might get it perfectly, correct or be very close, but most would simply be able to write down the general idea of what I was conveying. Throw in your adrenaline being through the roof, thinking that you're about to die in a torrential storm all around you, and my personal guess is that no one recorded what I said verbatim, but most were simply able to convey the general idea of what I was saying. I'm sure that there would be even a few who would be like, "Wait, you said something that we were supposed to pay attention to?" All I remember was a crazy storm. Now, the last thing I wanted to discuss about these disciples waking Jesus up before we talk about his response to them was that the disciples were wise enough to turn to the one person who could truly save them. And not just from the storm, but truly save them eternally. The reality is that sometimes it takes us being in these men's position to get to that point of desperation where we truly feel like we're perishing for us to turn to God and ask them to save us. I know that personally for me, that was most certainly the case. I had to be brought to my lowest of lows so that I would finally look up. And just like these men, there was a theoretical storm all around me, tossing me around like a brag doll, and I'd used everything in my own power to try to fix my life, and I exhausted all my personal resources, and despite my best efforts, the situation only got worse. All until I came to the realization that I can't do this on my own. I need God. So, just like these men, I came to Jesus saying, "Lord, I'm perishing. saved me, and just like that, the storm in my life settled. I was finally at peace. The best part, though, is that now I know that I have Jesus with me. And with that fact, life could throw a storm 2 times, 10 times, or even 100 times worse than me, and my peace will remain because I have Jesus. So that said, let's take a look at Jesus' response, which was, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Now, if we didn't know that Jesus was fully God, who was abounding in all godly perfections and the fruit of the Spirit, we might think that this response was one that was slightly too harsh due to Jesus having his peaceful rest ruined. The same way, that we as parents were never our most loving, patient, or caring selves when we're woken up from a nap or in the middle of the night by a needy kid. We will no doubt take care of our kids' need, but we're certainly not doing so with a smile on our face, and our only focus is doing whatever needs to be done as quickly as possible so that we can drift back to sleep. However, Jesus, being the most patient and selfless person to ever walk the planet, was not reacting to his disciples' request out of the condition of being tired and cranky. He wasn't even rebuking them for waking him up to save them. Let's take a look at the text again to see what upset him. It says, "Why are you afraid?" He was upset that they woke him up out of fear. They didn't come to him in the way that, for example, David did in his Psalms, where he would see like the terrifying reality of being surrounded by armies of his enemies, completely outnumbered. Yet regardless of how desperate the situation always appeared, David would always remember the faithfulness and steadfast nature of God and how he had been saved by him over and over again. And he would always pray that God would deliver him so that God could be glorified through it. Jesus also says that these disciples had little faith. Yet at the same time, Jesus also tells them later that if they have faith as small as the mustard seed, then they could have God transplant a tree if it is indeed part of God's will. Notice here, though, that despite him saying that their faith was little, it was still enough. It didn't require the faith of the centurion that Jesus had just praised up for him to be bothered with getting out of bed and doing what only God could do in that situation. The same is true with how we are saved eternally. Faith of any size is saving faith, so long as that faith is rooted firmly in Jesus Christ. God's word tells us over and over again, call out to him and he listens. If it is part of God's plan, and of course, for the disciples, them safely finishing their sea voyage certainly was, then God will answer that cry. Even if we feel like Jesus is asleep while life is a raging whirlwind around us, it's really going to be just that Jesus is in control of the situation and knows that you have nothing to worry about. Or quite possibly, it's simply that he's waiting for you to come to him with a prayer. Not rooted in fear, although as we can clearly see here that even if it is, it will still be answered. But he is just waiting for you to ask so that he can provide, protect, and be your refuge. Thinking of it in another way, I think we can all agree that even if they hadn't woken Jesus up, that they would have still arrived on the other side safe and sound regardless, even if it was in a much wetter condition. And Jesus, once he got woken up, he certainly could have told his disciples to just like, hey, relax. I promise you, we're all going to arrive in one piece. However, this did provide yet another opportunity for Jesus to showcase his authority. He'd already put this on display by rebuking demons, the way he taught even, healing leprosy and healing all kinds of illnesses and infirmities, sometimes without even having to be in the physical presence of the person he was healing. And now he got the chance to put his authority over nature on display as well. More specifically, Jesus rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Now, of course, we do read about other prophets performing miracles that God led them to perform in regards to the sea, such as Moses parting the waters with the staff, Joshua with the Ark of the Covenant, and then with both Elijah and Elisha parting the waters with the same cloak. However, in those cases, a physical object was involved. However, for Jesus, who himself is the Logos, or the Word, who created all things, all that was needed was his word. And then as soon as he rebuked the winds and the sea, there was a great calm. Like it went from 100 to 0 in a split second. The quickness that this happened was most likely the most astonishing part that just mind boggled the disciples. After all, like I said earlier, a third of these men were fishermen who had been at sea, the majority of their lives. And no doubt they had experienced countless storms, all of which take time to settle down. And even after the rain and lightning passes, the effects of the storm remain for quite some time in terms of the waves and choppiness of the waters. And in fact, not only did Jesus cause this storm and sea, to become perfectly calm, but he also calmed the fears of these men. And in doing so, in such a miraculous fashion, he was able to help them build their faith in him. With that, we will wrap up today's study. As always, I do hope that you found this informative, engaging, and hopefully entertaining as well. If so, please smash that like button below and leave a comment if you would be so kind, just to help YouTube push this content to those that might need to hear it, since that is obviously the whole reason why I spend my time doing all these videos for you. Also, in the next video, we were going to be finishing up chapter 8 of Matthew, and we're going to come to the passage where Jesus sends a legion of demons into pigs. And of course, we're not only going to be addressing the interesting question as far as why Jesus did that, but also we're going to take a good portion of the video to discuss worship. And that is a topic that I'm very excited to discuss with you all. So if you haven't already, please consider clicking that subscribe button and notification bell below so you don't miss that when it comes out. But that said, I look forward to seeing you all the next time. God bless and keep you.